Hashtag the Oakville Blobs, the rain that made a town sick and the evidence that vanished. What would you do if something fell from the sky, not rain, not snow, not hail, but translucent, gelatinous blobs that splattered across your town like something alive, and within hours of touching them, you became violently ill? And what would you think if, decades later, you discovered that every single laboratory sample of that substance had been confiscated, destroyed, or conveniently lost, and that the one microbiologist brave enough to go public with her findings vanished from professional life entirely, as though she'd been erased? This is not science fiction. This is not a creepypasta. This happened in a small American town, and the deeper I dug into this story, the more I realized that the strangest part isn't what fell from the sky. It's what happened afterward. Because someone went to extraordinary lengths to make sure we would never know what it was. And recently released FOIA documents suggest that someone may have been the United States military. Let me take you to Oakville, Washington. August 7, 1994. And I need you to pay very close attention. Because some of the details in this story have never been discussed publicly until now. Oakville, Washington is the kind of town that most Americans will never visit, never think about, and never hear mentioned in conversation. It sits in Grays Harbor County, in the western part of the state, nestled among logging roads and low-hanging Pacific fog. The population in 1994 hovered around 600 people. That's not a neighborhood. That's barely a block in most cities. Oakville is the sort of place where everyone knows everyone, where pickup trucks outnumber sedans, where the local gossip travels faster than any broadband signal ever could. It's also the kind of place where, if something strange happened, authorities could reasonably expect it to go unnoticed by the wider world. Remember that. It becomes important later. In August of 1994, the Pacific Northwest was experiencing an unusually warm and humid stretch. The air was thick. Clouds rolled in off the coast carrying moisture that smelled faintly of the sea. Residents were used to rain. Western Washington is one of the wettest regions in the continental United States. Rain was not news. Rain was background noise. But on August 7, just before dawn, something fell from those clouds that was not rain. Officer David Lacey of the Oakville Police Department was on patrol in the early morning hours when the substance began to hit his windshield. He activated his wipers, and instead of clearing, the material smeared across the glass in thick, translucent streaks. He later described it as gelatinous, like jello that hadn't fully set. It was slightly opaque, roughly the size of grains of rice in some cases and as large as $50 in others. It was cold to the touch. And it covered everything: the roads, the rooftops, the lawns, the vehicles parked along the quiet streets of town. Lacey pulled over. He got out of his cruiser and looked up at the sky. The blobs were still falling. Softly. Silently. Like a parody of rainfall. He reached down and touched one with his bare hand. Within hours, David Lacey was in the hospital. He reported nausea, vertigo, and severe difficulty breathing. His vision blurred. He felt, in his words, like every ounce of energy had been sucked from his body. He wasn't alone. Across Oakville, residents who had come into contact with the substance, some of whom had handled it out of simple curiosity, others who had merely walked through areas where it had fallen, began reporting strikingly similar symptoms. And here's where the first deeply unsettling pattern emerges. There are 5 things about the initial wave of illness that nobody in any official capacity has ever been able to explain. 1. The onset was rapid. Symptoms appeared within 2 to 12 hours of contact, far faster than most environmental contaminants or bacterial infections would typically manifest. 2. The symptoms were nearly identical across all affected individuals. Nausea. Extreme fatigue. Difficulty breathing. Vertigo. Inner ear pressure. This uniformity suggests a single causative agent, not a coincidental cluster of different illnesses. 3. Animals were affected more severely than humans. Dottie Hearn, one of the first residents to report the substance, had a cat that came into contact with the blobs on her porch. The cat was dead within days. Multiple residents reported pets, dogs, cats, even outdoor animals, becoming lethargic and dying in the weeks following the event. 4. The substance fell not once, but 6 times over a 3-week period. 6 separate events. Whatever was producing this material, it wasn't a one-time atmospheric anomaly. Something was delivering it. Repeatedly. 5. By the time any official agency arrived to investigate, the substance had largely dissolved. It degraded rapidly when exposed to open air, almost as if it was designed to be temporary. Designed to disappear. Keep that word in mind. Designed. Now, in any small town, when something inexplicable happens, the first instinct is to call someone who might have answers. Residents contacted the Washington State Department of Ecology. They contacted local health officials. Some even called the National Weather Service. The responses they received ranged from dismissive to bewildered. The Department of Ecology reportedly sent a representative who collected samples and then, nothing. No follow-up report was ever issued. No findings were ever shared with the community. The samples, as far as anyone in Oakville was told, simply ceased to exist in any official record. But one sample survived. And this is where the story takes its most significant turn. A resident, and accounts vary on exactly who, managed to preserve a small quantity of the substance in a sealed container and delivered it to a local hospital. From there, the sample was examined by a microbiologist named Sonny Barclift, who worked at a facility associated with the Grays Harbor area. What Barclift found under the microscope was alarming. The gelatinous material contained white blood cells. Human white blood cells. Specifically, she identified what appeared to be eukaryotic cells, cells with nuclei, embedded within the matrix of the gel. This was not pollen. This was not industrial waste. This was not jellyfish remnants carried inland by unusual weather patterns, which was one of the more creative official explanations floated at the time. This was biological material containing components consistent with human cellular matter, encased in a substance that no one could identify. Barclift was not a conspiracy theorist. She was not a fringe figure. She was a working microbiologist who examined a sample and reported what she found. And what she found made no sense within any conventional framework. She went public with her findings. She spoke to local media. She spoke to a reporter named Brian Vanderbrug. She described the cellular structures in the substance and stated plainly that she could not explain how human white blood cells could be present in material that had fallen from the sky. And then 3 things happened in rapid succession that should deeply concern anyone paying attention. First, the hospital's sample was requested by the Washington State Department of Health for further analysis. It was transferred. And then it was reported lost. Gone. No chain of custody documentation. No explanation. Simply, lost. Second, a second sample that had been independently preserved by a private citizen was allegedly collected by individuals who identified themselves as representatives of a federal agency. The exact agency has never been confirmed. The sample was never returned. No receipt was provided. No report was ever filed. Third, and this is the detail that haunts me most, Sonny Barclift, the microbiologist, essentially disappeared from professional life. She stopped publishing. She stopped appearing at conferences. She stopped responding to media inquiries. People who attempted to contact her in the years following her analysis described hitting dead ends. Not refusals to comment. Not polite declines. Dead ends. As though the professional identity of Sonny Barclift had been quietly dismantled. I want to be careful here. I am not claiming that Sonny Barclift was silenced by a shadowy government agency. I am not claiming she was threatened or harmed. What I am telling you is that a working scientist examined a substance, reported findings that contradicted every official explanation, and then became unreachable. And every sample she analyzed vanished. You can draw your own conclusions. But I'd like to offer you some additional information before you do. For decades, the Oakville Blobs existed in a strange liminal space in American paranormal lore. It was too well documented to dismiss entirely. A police officer, a microbiologist, multiple witnesses, and even a segment on the television show Unsolved Mysteries had covered it. But it was also too localized and too strange to attract sustained investigative attention. It became one of those stories that people referenced in passing, a curiosity, a weird footnote. But in recent years, something changed. Researchers, independent investigators, FOIA specialists, and a handful of journalists began submitting Freedom of Information Act requests related to military activity in the Pacific Northwest during the summer of 1994. And the documents that came back, partially redacted, fragmentary, and in some cases suspiciously incomplete, painted a picture that had never been publicly explored. Let me walk you through what these documents suggest, piece by piece. Because the picture they paint is far more disturbing than falling gelatin. The first relevant document is a Department of Defense logistics report from Joint Base Lewis McChord, which is located approximately 90 miles northeast of Oakville. The report, dated July 1994, 1 month before the first blob event, references what is described as an atmospheric dispersal exercise scheduled for the Grays Harbor operational zone. The language is technical and heavily redacted, but the geographic coordinates referenced in the unredacted portions correspond to an area that includes Oakville and its immediate surroundings. Atmospheric dispersal exercise. Let that phrase settle. The second document is an Environmental Protection Agency internal memo from September 1994, 1 month after the events, that references an inquiry from an unnamed Washington state official regarding unidentified biological material in the Oakville, Washington municipal area. The memo notes that the inquiry was forwarded to a division within the EPA that handles, and I'm quoting directly here, Joint Environmental Defense Matters. The memo's routing information shows it was CC'd to a Department of Defense liaison office. The memo then simply ends. There is no follow-up. No response documented. No resolution. The third document is the most troubling. It's a partially declassified report from a division of the armed forces that dealt with what was termed broad area biological defense testing. This document does not mention Oakville by name. It does not reference the blob events directly. But it describes a series of tests conducted in the Pacific Northwest between 1993 and 1995 that involved the aerial release of simulated biological agents over populated areas to study dispersal patterns, atmospheric behavior, and civilian exposure vectors. Simulated biological agents. Released from aircraft. Over populated areas. In the Pacific Northwest. During the exact time frame of the Oakville events. If you feel a chill right now, good. Because this is where the historical context becomes essential, and where this story stops being about mysterious rain and starts being about something far more systematic. The United States military has a documented, admitted, and legally verified history of conducting biological and chemical tests on unsuspecting civilian populations. This is not conjecture. This is congressional record. In 1977, the Senate Church Committee hearings revealed that the CIA and the Department of Defense had conducted at least 239 open-air biological warfare tests on American soil between 1949 and 1969 under programs including Project Shad and Operation LAC. In one of the most infamous incidents, the Navy sprayed Serratia marcescens, a bacterium believed at the time to be harmless, over the San Francisco Bay Area in 1950. Residents subsequently reported a spike in urinary tract infections, and at least one person, a man named Edward Nevin, died from a Serratia marcescens infection that his doctors could not explain. In the 1960s, the Army released zinc-cadmium sulfide particles, a chemical tracer, over large portions of the Midwest from aircraft and ground-based generators. The tests were conducted over cities including Minneapolis and St. Louis. Residents were never informed. The particles were later found to contain a radioactive component that had not been disclosed in the original test protocols. In 1966, the Army dropped light bulbs filled with Bacillus subtilis bacteria into the New York City subway system to study how biological agents would disperse through underground transit networks. Millions of commuters were exposed without their knowledge or consent. These are not conspiracy theories. These are admitted facts, confirmed by congressional investigation and in some cases by the military itself. The U.S. government has sprayed, dropped, dispersed, and released biological and chemical agents over its own citizens dozens of times, across decades, in programs that were classified, denied, and only revealed years after the fact. So when I tell you that FOIA documents suggest the military was conducting atmospheric dispersal exercises over the Grays Harbor area in the summer of 1994, I am not asking you to take a wild leap of faith. I am asking you to recognize a pattern of behavior that is historically consistent and thoroughly documented. And I need to take you deeper. Because there's a layer to this that most researchers have missed entirely. In the early 1990s, the Department of Defense was deep into a program known as the Biological Defense Research Program. This initiative, which operated under the auspices of the U.S. Army Medical Research Institute of Infectious Diseases, USAMRIID, was ostensibly focused on defensive measures against biological weapons. But internal documents and later congressional inquiries revealed that the line between defensive research and offensive testing was, in practice, almost non-existent. To study how to defend a population against a biological attack, you need to understand how biological agents disperse. How they travel on wind currents. How they settle on surfaces. How they penetrate structures. How they affect organisms of different sizes and metabolic rates. And to understand those things, you need to conduct dispersal tests. Real ones. In real atmospheric conditions. Over real terrain. With real populations serving as unwitting data points. The Pacific Northwest was considered an ideal testing ground for several reasons. The atmospheric conditions, coastal fog, low cloud cover, high humidity, prevailing westerly winds, closely mimic the conditions under which a real biological attack might occur. The population density was low enough to minimize the number of people exposed but high enough to generate statistically meaningful data. And the geography, isolated towns connected by long stretches of rural highway, made it comparatively easy to monitor dispersal patterns without attracting attention. Oakville fits every single one of those criteria perfectly. Now, I want to return to the substance itself. Because if we accept, even provisionally, the hypothesis that the Oakville Blobs were the result of a military atmospheric dispersal test, we need to ask, what was the substance? What was its purpose? And why did it contain what appeared to be human white blood cells? This is where the story enters its darkest territory. One of the lesser-known aspects of biological defense research involves the use of what are called simulant agents. These are substances that mimic the physical properties of actual biological weapons, their weight, their dispersal characteristics, their particle size, their behavior in various atmospheric conditions, without being pathogenic themselves. Or at least, without being intended to be pathogenic. The history of simulant agents is littered with cases where substances believed to be harmless turned out to cause significant health effects. Serratia marcescens, which I mentioned earlier, was considered a harmless simulant for decades before its pathogenic potential was recognized. Zinc-cadmium sulfide was classified as inert before its radioactive contamination was discovered. The military's track record of accurately assessing the safety of its own test materials is, to put it charitably, abysmal. Some researchers have speculated that the Oakville substance may have been a biological simulant matrix, a gel designed to carry and disperse cellular or microbiological material in a way that mimicked the behavior of an actual weaponized biological agent. The gelatinous consistency would allow the material to remain cohesive during aerial release and then fragment upon impact, dispersing its contents over a wide area. The rapid degradation of the substance in open air would be a desirable feature in a test scenario, as it would minimize the window of detectability and reduce the likelihood of the material being collected and analyzed by unauthorized parties. The presence of white blood cells, if Barcliffe's analysis was accurate, is potentially the most revealing detail of all. White blood cells are a key component of the human immune response. A simulant designed to test how biological material interacts with human tissue after atmospheric dispersal might logically contain human cellular material. You'd want to see how those cells survived the dispersal process, how they degraded, how they interacted with the environment after landing. This would mean that the military was not merely testing how a substance travels through the air. It was testing how biological material, potentially including components harvested from human sources, behaves when released over a populated area. And the people of Oakville were the test subjects. They were never asked. They were never informed. They were never compensated. They were never even acknowledged. And when one of them got curious enough to have the substance professionally analyzed, every sample was confiscated or destroyed, and the analyst who examined them was removed from public professional life. I need to address the counterarguments, because intellectual honesty demands it. The most commonly cited alternative explanation for the Oakville Blobs is that they were the remnants of jellyfish, specifically the species Aurelia aurita, that had been pulverized by military bombing exercises off the Washington coast and subsequently carried inland by weather systems. This explanation was promoted by several officials at the time and has been repeated in numerous subsequent accounts. There are 4 significant problems with this theory. 1. The distance from the coast to Oakville is approximately 17 miles inland. While it is theoretically possible for organic material to be carried inland by strong weather systems, the Oakville Blobs fell during conditions that did not include the kind of severe storms necessary to transport heavy biological material that distance. The weather was warm and humid, not violent. 2. Jellyfish tissue does not contain human white blood cells. Barcliffe's analysis specifically identified eukaryotic cells consistent with human leukocytes. No amount of jellyfish pulverization produces human cellular material. 3. The substance fell 6 times over 3 weeks. A single bombing exercise might conceivably loft organic material into the atmosphere once. 6 separate events, spaced over 21 days, suggest a deliberate, repeated process, not a natural consequence of a single military exercise. 4. If the substance were merely jellyfish remnants, there would be no reason for samples to be confiscated, lost, or suppressed. There would be no reason for federal agencies to become involved. There would be no reason for the samples to disappear from every laboratory that held them. Jellyfish are not classified. Jellyfish are not sensitive. You do not need to destroy evidence of jellyfish. The jellyfish theory is not an explanation. It is a cover story. And it is a remarkably lazy one. Another explanation that has been floated is that the substance was star jelly, a folk term for various gelatinous substances found on the ground after rainstorms, often attributed to algae, fungal growths, or the regurgitated remains of amphibian prey consumed by birds. Star jelly is a real phenomenon, but it is typically found in small, isolated deposits, not raining from the sky over an entire town. And star jelly does not make people violently ill. And star jelly does not contain human white blood cells. Every conventional explanation that has been offered for the Oakville Blobs fails to account for the totality of the evidence. And every conventional explanation conveniently avoids addressing the most troubling aspects of the event, the confiscation of samples, the disappearance of the analyst, and the presence of military atmospheric testing in the exact area during the exact time frame. Let me introduce one more piece of the puzzle that has only recently come to light and that, as far as I can determine, has never been discussed in any major public forum. In 2019, a researcher who goes by the pseudonym M. Hale, for reasons that will become obvious, submitted a FOIA request to USAMRIID specifically requesting any documents related to atmospheric biological simulant testing in Washington state, 1993 to 1995. The response, which took 14 months, consisted of approximately 60 pages of documents, roughly 40% of which were redacted. But among the unredacted portions was a reference to something called Project Rainshadow. The document describes Project Rainshadow as a field validation program for